Welcome to this Flight Free UK event. Is there anything sustainable about sustainable aviation fuel? I'm really pleased to be joined by three fabulous speakers, Kate Hewitt from the Aviation Environment Federation, Finley Asher from Safe Landing, Rachel Smolka from Biofuel Watch, and then I'm Anna Hughes from Flight Free UK. So the first thing I'll do is ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So Kate, would you like to go first and tell our audience who you are? And on the screen now, you'll see all the links to Kate's work.
Hi, thanks very much for having me, Anna. I'm Kate Hewitt. I'm Policy Director at the Aviation Environment Federation. We formed actually in the 1970s as a federation of community groups. The name sounds a bit kind of old-fashioned these days, but that's our history. We formed actually as a noise organisation, but most of the work these days has been about climate change. We still have a membership, and I'm happy to see one or two of our members even on this call, which is really nice. We campaign on aviation for people and the environment, we have a lot of contact with UK NGOs who take, I guess, a variety of positions on sustainable aviation fuel. But we actually had an event recently where there was really no disagreement about there being, whatever people's individual emphasis is, that's where the kind of UK environmental movement is.
Thank you, Kate. Brilliant to have you. So next we will have Finley. Would you like to give your introduction, please?
Yes, so I'm Finley. I'm part of a group called Safe Landing. We're a group for aviation workers that have worked in the sector before, are still working in it. Anything from pilots, cabin crew, air traffic controllers. I'm an engineer, aerospace engineer. I've been designing aircraft engines. So we are concerned about the impact of our sector. We want to reduce it as rapidly as possible, and empower each other to act from within the sector to make those changes. We are really keen that our industry is honest about its environmental impact and is realistic about what's possible with technology. Therefore, we believe that we do need to limit how much we fly and how much fuel we burn. So we're really keen to unpick some of the greenwash that comes from our industry. But from the perspective of worker first angle, we don't think that sort of kidding ourselves is good for our industry and for our long-term careers. And we want our business leaders and political leaders to be making like sensible decisions that safeguard our ability to continue to travel in the future. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Finley. And then over to you, Rachel, dialing in from Vermont on the east coast of the USA. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am co-director of Biofuel Watch. Alma Ernsting, who is based in the UK, wasn't able to be here today. So I'm sort of filling in for her, being a stand-in at the UK event. Biofuel Watch has worked for many years on a wide range of different bioenergy topics, and aviation biofuels having emerged in the last few years as being a major new juggernaut, if you will. Our focus and my background is in biology, natural history, and ecology. So I have been especially concerned about biodiversity impacts of large-scale monocultures for bioenergy, and that's kind of where I come from. And I look forward to this event. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should probably introduce myself as well. So I'm Anna, the director of Flight Free UK. Our links are just on the screen right now. So our aim is to reduce the amount people fly in order to reduce emissions from aviation. We do that by a behaviour change challenge called the Flight Free Challenge, which asks people to take 1 year off flying as a way to try the alternatives and, of course, reduce emissions straight away. We inform people of the environmental impact of aviation, and we inspire people to travel without flying. So that's kind of our remit, and that's why one of the reasons we're hosting this event, to give a bit more information about what the industry says in terms of reducing emissions from aviation. Because of course, the crux of this is sustainable aviation fuel. That is something that the industry has been talking about for several years now. And our question here this evening is there anything sustainable about sustainable aviation fuel? So the first thing I'm going to just outline is, what is it? What is SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel? And there are a few different answers, and I'll come to Finley and Rachel in a moment to give some specifics. But generally, we are looking at alternative fuels to kerosene. So jet fuel is kerosene, it's a fossil fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel, so called, is from a variety of sources. So perhaps biofuel, so plants. It could be, so some of the stories in the news recently have been about used cooking oil, so chip fat, for example. Also, animal fats can be used. Landfill waste, those kinds of things can all be converted into oil to use instead of kerosene. And in fact, I'm just going to add some links here in the chat right now. There's quite a few links right there of some fairly recent news articles which explain a little bit more about where SAF comes from. So the first one in the first link refers to a flight which was at the end of last year. It was by Virgin Atlantic, and they flew from London to New York with 100% sustainable aviation fuel. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, but basically it was a mixture of animal fats and used cooking oil type fats. And it was an experiment to kind of demonstrate that it is possible to fly with 100% SAF, because again, as we will discover during this event, current usage of SAF is very low. The ratio mix of sustainable fuels to kerosene is very low. We've also recently had in the news that we might be using human waste to power planes. So there's a link to a story talking about a plant in Harwich, I think it is, which is producing human waste to power planes. There's an article there that dissects the animal fats source and looks at if on balance that could be worse for the environment than using jet fuel. There's a nice kind of irreverent article there about using chip fats for planes, and a bit of information about what the government is aiming for. So there's a target of having 10% SAF by 2030. So yeah, as I kind of hinted, and as we will explore a bit later, current SAF usage is really low, and the target of 10% by 2030 isn't particularly high. So yeah, we'll look at that as well. And then finally, there's quite an interesting, very useful resource here from Hannah Ritchie, Sustainability by Numbers. And she runs a regular newsletter from her Substack, which I would highly recommend you sign up for. There's a few that are specifically about aviation, but generally it's about sustainability and looking at how viable certain solutions are. And this one's very interesting, that link I've just posted in the chat. How much biofuel would we need to decarbonize aviation? And it looks at the numbers and says, if all the world's biofuels were used for aviation, because of course they currently are used for many other things, if they were all diverted to be used for aviation, they could have met just a third of global demand in 2019. With the projected growth of aviation, it would require 4 to 5 times more biofuel. And again, that's just for aviation. That's not for any of the other things that we currently use biofuel for. So a short overview there and some really useful links for you to have a look at as well. So yeah, do copy those down and have a look later. But now I will come to Rachel first to explain about biofuel. Of course, that's your area of expertise. So if you can just give us an outline and a summary of the different sources of biofuel so we have a bit more of a clear picture.
Yeah, well, I think at the sort of top level, it's important to keep in mind, the sort of what is real and what is feasible technically and happening now versus the hype and rhetoric around using human waste, for example, or even municipal solid waste, wood, some of these other feedstocks that people talk about using for sustainable aviation fuel, which aren't really proven technologies. What is proven is using vegetable oils, and that is happening. Vegetable oils meaning soy, corn, canola, um, palm oil, which is very contentious and in some cases is not permitted. But because all of these vegetable oil markets are all connected to each other, what we see is when there's an increased demand for, say, soya, which is probably one, I think, the biggest land area footprint. But when we expand demand for one of these vegetable oil markets, the others are drawn up through the markets as replacements for those. So more soya oil, even if palm oil is not permitted, does end up driving the market for palm oil, because palm oil is then fulfilling the market that's happening elsewhere in the vegetable market. I think that's a little confusing way to say it, but the point is that all of these different vegetable oils are connected through the market, and they impact each other. So yeah, those vegetable oils and hydro treated vegetable oils, it's also, that's the main game for aviation fuels right now. There are facilities that are producing those in significant volumes around the place. Here in California, we have two big oil refineries that have been converting to produce what's called renewable diesel, which is, essentially an aviation grade biofuel. And part of the thing for them is that they've got these facilities for doing the part of the processing in an oil refinery that involves a lot of hydrogen. And so they can hydrotreat vegetable oils as well. So it helps them to keep from having their assets stranded entirely, because they've got this infrastructure for hydrotreating in place already. So the vegetable oils is a big part of it. And then, of course, there's also animal fats from slaughterhouses. And yeah, it's kind of disgusting, really, to think about. But that's another source of fat for producing these kinds of fuels. And then there's used cooking oil. And what I would say about used cooking oil, I think that's the most important, is that we're seeing in Europe, there's been some media coverage about this, that there's a tremendous amount of fraud going on in the used cooking oil trade, where, and it's very difficult to sort that out and figure out what it is. A lot of times it's palm oil that's being trafficked as used cooking oil. The other thing is that, there's a lot of concern about, cooking oil is food, right? And the impacts, again, on the price points of oils, vegetable oils and edible oils that are used, impacts the availability and the affordability of cooking oil for people to consume. So that's another issue. I was just recently looking at some from the California's low carbon fuel standard, where they're debating about, certifications of different companies' products. And there's so many different facilities now that are saying, we're going to make aviation biofuels. Yeah, there's all kinds of subsidies out there, and we want those subsidies. And so, for example, one company, Diamond Green, which is located in Louisiana, they put in an application which had imports of tallow, animal fats, and vegetable oils and used cooking oil from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from all over the world. They're importing and shipping in all these different kinds of fats into these refineries now to make into into renewable diesel aviation / sustainable aviation fuels. So yeah, I'll stop there. I think Finley's got probably a lot to add to that.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a great overview. So Finley, would you like to take us through more of the e-fuels side of things? So biofuels is a majority, isn't it, of sustainable aviation fuel, but of course there are other synthetic fuels as well. Could you take us through those, please?
Yes. So yeah, but for biofuels, we call the feedstock biomass. So it's plant matter. And obviously it's energy taken from the sun that's gone into the plant, and then we harvest the plant and we get the carbon out of that. What we can do instead is we can sort of do that mechanically, industrially, using renewable energy as our input and powering some devices. The first is to suck carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a process called direct air capture. This is like a kind of air conditioning unit for the atmosphere that sucks large amounts of air through, filters the carbon out, releases that and stores it. So you've got some carbon that you've taken from the air. The other thing is you could capture carbon from an industrial process. So, you've got cement manufacturing or steel or a power station, capture the carbon there. In that case, though, that's like fossil fuels being recycled. So there's still fossil fuels in the system. So sort of for it to be a renewable fuel, it needs to be renewably powered, taking carbon from the atmosphere. So you've then got some carbon, and then you need to get some hydrogen. And you get hydrogen by running a process called electrolysis. So this takes water, that's H2O, and you separate the hydrogen from the oxygen by applying electricity, again powered by renewable energy, and then you've got some hydrogen. If you then combine the carbon with the hydrogen, you get a hydrocarbon. It's a process called the Fischer-Tropsch process that does that, and it's sort of, you then get a crude oil output from that is like a liquid hydrocarbon, basically like oil, but the carbon has come from the atmosphere rather than from stored carbon deep underground like fossil fuels. So that's why you hear those being called synthetic fuels or electrofuels or e-fuels for short. Sometimes you also hear power to liquid because you get electrical power and you get liquid fuel out. And then the other thing just to say is the industry is also planning, like considering the feasibility of just using hydrogen straight. So if you have hydrogen, there's issues with storing it. I'll maybe get into that later if you want, but basically you burn hydrogen in a combustor or you put it into a fuel cell and it converts to electricity and you drive an electrical motor. Hydrogen, if you combust it, you combine it with oxygen again and you get water out. You don't get any carbon dioxide. So it kind of burns zero emissions at the output, and you put renewable energy in at the start.
Great explanation. Thanks, Finley, for taking us through that. Okay, so Kate, I want to come to you now because the industry talks about sustainable aviation fuels as reducing emissions by up to 80%. That's quite a common statement. But we know that burning oil, regardless of how that's made, creates emissions, and that seems to be the same emissions as burning kerosene. So there's no direct reduction in when it's burned, when the SAF is burned, but the savings are made during the life cycle of the product. So can you, one of the phrases that you in the Aviation Environment Federation use is that the sustainability of SAF needs to be assessed, not assumed. I think that's a really good way to sum it up. So can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that and about that kind of life cycle savings in terms of emissions?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the problems that we have is that the industry has got away with calling this fuel sustainable. I think it's hard to turn back the clock on that. We try, as many people do, I think, here, to talk about so-called sustainable aviation fuel. We try and talk about alternative fuels, alternative jet fuel, but yeah, it's hard to fight back, I think, at this point against this kind of term SAF, which, you know, has really kind of taken hold. But yeah, I mean, the assess not assume thing is really just a reminder, I suppose, to all of us to keep questioning the assumption that just because the fuel is made from something other than fossil kerosene, that it is by definition sustainable. I mean, government obviously does this all the time. They talk about sustainable airport expansion, you know, sustainable growth of aviation, and it doesn't really mean anything. And I think one interesting finding that I saw recently is that the public is actually fairly skeptical about the use of that term. So that's kind of heartening. You know, we've got some people asking questions on our side. Heathrow Airport put out a media release recently about their fly up breakfast. I don't know if you came across this, Anna. That they're going to do, they're now offering cooked breakfasts from which they save supposedly the fat and turn it into aviation fuel. And they're doing this, they said, partly because they know that actually the public doesn't really trust SAF. They quoted a really recent survey that said only about a quarter of the British public actually believe that sustainable aviation fuel will make the industry, you know, at lower emission or something like that. I haven't got the terms in front of me. But yeah, I think that we need to just keep challenging, I guess, the terminology. That's part of the point. And then in terms of the sort of wider questions, yeah, it was a real light bulb moment for me, I think, a few years ago, when it kind of just clicked in my mind, this thing that, yeah, the reason why the industry likes SAF is because it operates like kerosene, so they don't need to change anything. They don't need to change their aircraft or anything like this. They can blend it in, so they don't actually need to do anything very much in terms of demand or anything like that. But the reason why they can do that is because it is just like it is a hydrocarbon fuel, right? So it releases, as you said, as much CO2 at the tailpipe as kerosene does. And that's not something that comes across in either industry or government statements about this, that there are often claims that this fuel reduces the emissions from aviation by, you know, 70%, up to 80%, that kind of thing. And that's just misleading. Let's be kind. That's a highly misleading statement. If you then go back and say, well, what do you really mean by that? The answer is, oh, well, that's, you know, maybe 70% on a net basis. And it has to do with all kinds of assumptions around, as you say, what's called the life cycle analysis. So that there's a whole set of experts. There is a life cycle analysis community, as I've learned, who are experts who do, you know, the life cycle analysis methodologies for aviation and for other sectors. And, you know, are genuine people, and I don't want to, you know, make easy aspersions, I suppose, on the work that they do. But I think there are all kinds of questionable assumptions around what goes into a life cycle analysis number. So, for example, any kind of biological source of energy, any biogenic source of energy, is automatically allocated zero emissions in the LCA approach, on the assumption that at some point that CO2 would have gone back to the atmosphere, right? But it doesn't capture the fact that if you're taking something like a tree stump, you know, forestry waste is one of the things on the agenda, that might have sat in the forest and fed the soil and provided all kinds of, you know, good benefits in terms of the kind of forest ecosystem, and would have very, very slowly degraded. What you're doing instead is taking that out, turning it into an aviation fuel and releasing all that CO2 immediately into the atmosphere. That's not something that the LCA methodology knows how to capture. There are also all kinds of odd things around avoided emissions. So There are some LCA methodologies that allow you to give credit for things like avoided methane. So if instead of your waste sitting in a landfill site releasing methane, you turn it into aviation fuel, in some cases that can give you a value of greater than 100% benefit from using that waste in aviation. So the assumption is that actually using that fuel, putting it in an aircraft and flying around, actually benefits the climate compared with not flying. There are all kinds of odd quirks to LCA. So I think one of the arguments we're making is, at the very least, you need to look at sustainability much more broadly than simply accepting one single kind of LCA value. The other just really important thing I think that was like, oh my gosh, there's this point about because it doesn't reduce emissions at the tailpipe. I think SAFs really are a kind of offset, and that's not always a popular thing to say, but in my mind that makes more sense to me. They're not really reducing emissions in sector. They work, if they work at all, like an offset. But the other really important thing, I think, is that if you're using waste to make your fuel, which is very much the focus of the UK's policy, you're not actually reducing atmospheric CO2 from the level it is today in the making of your fuel. So I think it's really misleading to claim that you're reducing emissions at all, even on a net basis, if all you're doing is basically kind of opportunistically using some waste that at some point in the past might have absorbed CO2 and turning it into an aviation fuel and putting that back into the atmosphere. So yeah, those are kind of maybe quite techie points about all of this, but I think that there are some really important fundamental problems with the idea that these fuels reduce emissions.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I think it would be, let's delve into that to start with, actually, the concept of waste. I think that's a really good point to focus on. Also, I love the fly up thing, fly up, fry up. I mean, how greenwash is that? Just for anybody watching, if you're interested, and we'll touch on greenwash a bit in this event, but we do have an event dedicated to greenwash that we ran last year. So if you check out our Facebook page, then that has all of our past events. So if you want to look a bit more at greenwash, then that's where you need to go. Just to reiterate as well, before we carry on with the discussion, if you have any questions or any points to input to the discussion, then please add them to the chat. I can see that a few people are doing that already, which is great. If our panelists have a moment to take a look and respond, as Finley's done a couple of times already, that's really helpful. Yeah, so and anybody else who's attending who wants to share their thoughts and knowledge, that's also really useful. One of the things that's come up already in the chat is about the non-CO2 impacts of flying. And of course, we're broadly speaking about carbon emission savings at the moment with sustainable aviation fuel, but there are many other impacts and we can cover those as well. But yeah, let's come back to that specific issue of waste. So you mentioned landfill, Kate, and as you outlined, the claims of savings for SAF comes from the fact that if we use, for example, landfill waste, we convert that to oil to use in planes, then we are saving the emissions that would otherwise be created from it sitting in landfill. So that's where that saving claim comes from. And then there's also the other forms of waste that you were outlining, and we're now thinking about kind of maybe the moral aspect of this, especially when it comes to animal fats. Do we really want animal fats in our planes if we, for example, choose not to eat animal fats in our diets? But also the main thing that strikes me about the whole using waste, and I think describing it as offsetting is a really good description, Kate, because it is, isn't it? We are not incentivizing ourselves to reduce the amount of waste we produce. So we already send too much to landfill. We already waste too much. We create too much stuff. All of that has to go down. But maybe if we start to use that as a source for aviation fuel, it will reduce the incentive for us to cut down on the amount of waste we produce in the first place. So if we start to, sorry, I'll just skip on to the next slide. If we start to delve a little bit more into how this all sort of works, how does creating or reducing the amount of waste in landfill by creating oil out of it, how does biofuel reduce emissions because of the life cycle emissions absorption, and how practically do the savings come about? If you can take, I don't know if I think Kate gave a really nice overview of that already. Rachel, do you have anything to add at this point about those landfill to waste to oil processes and biofuel in terms of how much it reduces emissions, or how it reduces emissions? Sorry.
Yeah, I was actually typing in the chat wanting to share a briefing that we just did, which was on the company Fulcrum Bioenergy, which, you know, made a big story about flying on trash and, you know, solving the problem of too much waste by turning it into usable fuel and so on. This is not landfill gas, but actually taking the trash, which, you know, is composed of paper and plastic and God knows whatever people put in their garbage, and then sort of sorting out some of the materials and then grinding it up and putting it through a process that involves, you know, gasification and then Fischer-Tropsch upgrading, which is you know, first of all, is the problem of this gasification and Fischer-Tropsch, which has just not been technically very successful at all. Many companies have started up and are saying that they're going to use that as their process, but it's energy intensive, and the equipment tends to tar up and get gooped up and not function properly. There's a lot of fires and explosions at those facilities, and a very little commercial scale success with those. So immediately when I see that a company is going to talk about using those technologies, I think, okay, yeah, we'll see how this goes. And after 20 years of watching this, it's usually pretty clear that they're not going to succeed. And I think even the company developers understand ahead of time that they're probably not going to. I mean, if I can figure that out, somebody investing a bunch of money and time can figure that out. So that's where most of the like municipal solid waste and landfill stuff is going through that kind of rhetoric and claims that, and the other thing about that, of course, is that a lot of that is plastic, which is made from fossil fuels in the first place. So, you know, you're essentially burning fossil fuels when you're making fuel out of plastics. I mean, we have a problem with plastic pollution, there's no question, but that is not the solution. And creating a market for plastic waste is going to hinder efforts to try to reduce the production of plastics in the first place. So and I would just bring back to this that Fulcrum Bioenergy is, you know, one of many companies that are taking advantage of the rhetoric around making great use of wastes. And they have gone into financial trouble over the last couple of years, as have many others that we've watched over the years. And in spite of that, the UK government just recently granted them supports under their efforts to subsidize development of new aviation biofuels, along with some of the other companies that the UK government has recently, you know, been putting money into. Mark my words, a lot of these will fail. And, you know, we could say, oh, developing new technologies, we have to expect a certain amount of failures. But honestly, this has enough history now that we can confidently guess that it's basically just a way of getting subsidies to startup companies that see a way and perpetuating the industry's business as usual. So, yeah.
Thank
put
you,
a link
Rachel.
to
I
the
think
Fulcrum Bioenergy briefing into the chat in just a moment.
brilliant. Yeah, I was going to invite the panelists actually, if there are any links that you would like to share, please do. But yeah, that's such a good point, Rachel, that you raise about how this has been talked about for a long time now. And it feels like it's just another way for business as usual to continue. We have had the solutions, such as they have been touted as, laid out for years and years and years now. And we're no closer really to reducing aviation emissions. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Finlay, do you have anything to add here about?
Just really when it comes to, there is a couple of these facilities in the UK that have received government money, but also a lot private investment, interestingly, from the likes of Saudi Arabia, ExxonMobil, that sort of thing. And they're talking about household waste. And it does seem like it's a way you can imagine if you're a council and you're struggling to make ends meet, and you can say, actually, we can reduce our recycling requirements and actually just send all of our waste to this magical facility that will take it off our hands. That's quite enticing, but it's obviously just not how we should be running our waste management. We should be separating our plastics and glass and cardboard out, and we should be separating our food waste and actually composting it, sending it to an anaerobic digester where it can be turned into fertilizer and then actually used for growing more food. And we definitely shouldn't be sending it to landfill and then using that as the baseline to justify how good the fuel is. And particularly when we've also made commitments that we're going to stop doing that anyway. So it is a bit of a dodgy baseline, and that's why kind of Kate was right to mention the offset thing. We've got similar problems in the offset market where you just have the really fraudulent baseline. But yeah, I think the thing about the food waste is, yeah, so if you use plastic waste, it's just fossil fuels. It could be worse than fossil fuels. And then if you use food waste, that it's not just energy in there, there's also nutrients. So when we grow food, we often have to apply fertilizer to the soil so that it grows. If we then eat an apple and then the apple core, we chuck it away, there's nutrients in there that could be returned to the soil so that we don't have to apply even more fertilizer, which often comes from fossil fuels as well. And that's, if you talk to someone in waste management and environmental management, that's what they'd advise, rather than go and put it into this really energy intensive process to then burn in an aircraft.
Thanks, Finlay. I feel like your advice is eat the whole apple. Okay, so yeah, all of this talk about waste, it feels like it sounds as though it can create good sound bites for the industry and politicians. It sounds promising, but actually in practice, it's not going to really help particularly. Can we talk specifically about used cooking oil now? Because it feels from the kind of information that we've seen, it is there. We could use used cooking oil. In fact, the Virgin Atlantic flight that I mentioned at the beginning from London to New York on 100% sustainable SAF did use that. But that, from what I understand, is the majority of used cooking oil is currently used in the road fleet. So if we are to then divert that to aviation, that means that the road fleet is going to have to use fossil fuels. Does any of you want to come in on that and kind of explain a little bit more? Finlay, you're nodding. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's just, I suppose, used cooking oil is the easy thing because it basically already is a fuel. It requires very little processing to turn a waste oil and fat into a jet fuel. So that's why that's the one that's been commercialized so far. But yes, it already goes to a refinery, which then creates different outputs. So you will get some jet fuel, some diesel, and some biogas. And if we were to try and increase the amount of jet fuel, we'd have to reduce the others. And actually producing jet fuel is more energy intensive than the other ones. So we'd also make the process less efficient. We'd increase overall emissions, and we'd just be switching from one sector to the other. Obviously, we do need to be electrifying ground transport, but but for the next decade, probably the next two decades, there will still be some cars and definitely some trucks on the road using diesel. So if we did divert all of that to aviation instead, you would then get more fossil fuel use there. So it is sort of, but it does make sense to use the limited use cooking oil for this, as long as you could guarantee it wasn't fraudulent, which is another problem. But it's just also just that it's a very limited quantity. Maximum, you're really looking at 2-3% of jet fuel use. So it's also just can't be scaled. And we then need to look at other options.
Thank you. Okay, so Rachel or Kate, do you have anything to add on that?
What I would just add, just to emphasize the limited availability of used cooking oil. I mean, honestly, we burn something like 90 billion gallons of aviation fuel in a year globally, and we just don't eat that many French fries. And the collection and I would also add that one of the reasons that it's such a popular fuel source that is because the subsidies and supports are biased towards these waste streams, using waste streams. So like under various biofuel policies, you get a higher subsidy support for using used cooking oil than you would for virgin soy oil, for example. So there's an incentive there.
Okay, so let's come. Oh, sorry, Kate, carry on.
Yeah,
yes,
no, that's okay.
do.
I was going to add just one thing to say, you know, I sometimes do feel for our civil servants in the UK on this issue, because they've been given political targets to ramp up SAF, which was set because the politicians really wanted there to be a solution for aviation decarbonisation that did not involve constraining growth of the industry. And so, you know, the low carbon fuels team were told we're going to have 10% of SAF by 2030, and you need to go away and find out where that's coming from. And I just thought it's worth mentioning that the reason why we're talking a lot about waste in the UK and Europe in particular, as I understand it, it's kind of for good reason that our government has ruled out the idea of crop-based biofuel some years ago because of evidence that was really problematic. You know, we're not having that, you know, we went through this whole kind of, is it fuel or food discussion? They've said, okay, we won't do that. We recognize that our land is scarce. You know, they love the farming lobby. They recognize that land is scarce, though being kinder, and that it's, you know, as soon as you start using land to grow crops to turn into fuel, then you have all these problems with indirect land use change and deforestation and all the rest. So they've ruled that out. So they're looking at waste really because we have to reduce our waste, right? And it looks convenient. And as you said, Anna, it's a nice story as well. But as you know, a few people have said in the chat and has been referred to today, part of the consequence of that is we're left with really small amount of available feedstock to use. So even setting aside any kind of concerns about are we really reducing atmospheric CO2 by using waste, as soon as you start imposing what are necessary sustainability criteria onto these fuels, then you end up with a tiny amount of actual, you know, available feedstock, as it's called, to turn into this fuel. So the idea that, oh, we just need to get this industry going and then it's going to ramp up and be a really significant solution, that there's really poor evidence to support that position. And yeah, I think that governments who are setting you know, what might look like ambitious targets are going to find it really difficult to deliver those in a sustainable way, basically.
Yeah, great point, Kate, because as you've said, the feedstock is so limited that we have seen, and Rachel, you alluded to this earlier, that it's claimed that something comes from waste, but actually it comes from virgin plantations. It says that it's a waste product, but actually it's coming from new biofuel growth, or sorry, I shouldn't say biofuel. I should say crop-based biofuel, as you just said, Kate. But it is a really good point. We don't have enough space to grow the necessary biofuels. if we're using virgin crops, because we also have to feed ourselves. So should we quickly talk about that? Because even though, as you've just mentioned, Kate, the ambition is to move away from that, but those things are still used. Of course, plants absorb CO2 during their lifetime, which is why it can be claimed that there's a saving overall in terms of the life cycle. But planting those crops leads to deforestation, leads to social justice issues such as land grabs. So Rachel, do you want to talk briefly about that? And then we'll come to Finley.
Do you talk about land grabs?
Well, no, just the more the kind of the on balance crop-based biofuels being worse for the environment because of monoculture plantations, for example.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when biofuels first started to come into the fore, with 15 years, 20 years ago, we saw a wave of land grabbing happening around the globe as investors were seeing, dollar signs in buying up fertile agricultural lands. And they were doing that for a variety of reasons, but among them was the potential to make money off of growing biofuels, bioenergy feedstocks. And that land grabbing trend has not had as much attention recently, but it plays out in a lot of different ways because as if you put yourself in the state of mind of a farmer, your decision about what you're going to grow depends on what kind of price point you can get for it. So essentially, you've put competition between growing things for food and growing things for energy are now linked to each other. They're married at the hip, if you will. And so the price points decision making is playing those two things off each other in ways that doesn't tend to fare well for people who don't who are living on the margins of affordability in order to just feed their families and themselves. So in addition to people getting booted off their lands, often violently, a lot of the price impacts on food as a result of this competition between food and fuel has also been, it's a global justice issue at this point. I mean, the people who fly around is, 1% of the population or something. A very small handful of the human population gets on a plane ever in their life, or drives a car. So we're figuring out ways to use people's land to fund the transportation dreams of these rich sector of the population that can afford to do that. And we're putting the prices of food, pitting them against that. So somebody who has a big fat SUV and likes to drive or wants to get on an airplane, can afford a higher price for whatever that feedstock growth might have been. And the farmer is probably going to make a choice in favor of growing that. And of course, the land area footprint of these fuels, and especially for vegetable oil fuels like palm oil and soy and corn, are, huge, huge. And, if you go to places where this is happening, it's heartbreaking. You see no forest, you see no wildlife, nothing living. It's just oceans of soybeans growing, and they're sprayed with pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides, and the whole landscape is just, it's really dead, and it's really sad to see that. And this aviation biofuel push is creating an impetus for a huge expansion of that into existing and new agricultural lands.
Thank you, Rachel, for outlining that. Finley, do you want to add something on the social justice aspect here? I know you were talking about, specifically with e-fuel, you said that it would most likely result in appropriating the renewable energy supply from the global south.
Yeah, so I think just because obviously so far we've been discussing biofuels, and the thing about biomass is it's just very inefficient at converting sunlight into stored energy, whereas a solar panel is better, so we can get renewable electricity and then we could produce an e-fuel. But and that's hydrogen and direct air capture and combining those things. But the thing is, the process of producing hydrogen is very energy intensive, and you waste a lot of your energy, 30–40% of your energy. So you literally chuck away at least a third of it to begin with, just making the hydrogen. It's also very energy intensive taking carbon from the air because it's so distributed. It's only 400 parts per million. So within this room, there's not that much carbon. So it takes a lot of energy to do that. And then it's energy intensive to combine them together. And then you obviously burn it in a jet engine, and a jet engine's 30% efficient. So when you do the calculations and you work through, you sort of only end up with 10% of your renewable electricity actually like powering the aircraft along. And that means if you look at how much energy we'd need, it's humongous. So just like for the UK, we need like twice our low carbon energy supply. I think it's sort of 3 or 4 times the amount of wind power we've got today, 5 times the amount of nuclear, depending which one you'd go for. So it's massive. We did the calculations for the size of the wind farm that you'd need, and it's basically the size of Northern Ireland, an offshore wind farm that size. So the thing that you start looking at is you start saying, well, we don't actually, like, there's physical constraints around, like, technically wind and solar are sort of unlimited if we could just scale them as quickly as possible, but we need to build and commission these facilities. Often it does take more than 10 years to build wind turbines. There's lots of other stuff that we need renewable energy for. So there's also then the issue of appropriating renewable energy from other places. So particularly if you look at somewhere like Morocco that's got offshore wind, the Northern Africa where there's solar, and other places where there's more wind and solar, maybe in poorer parts of the world, we're going to like try and make e-fuels and hydrogen there and then transport it. And that's diverting energy that could be used for other things, for heating people's homes, for powering the energy grid, for powering ground transport. So it's sort of like another appropriation. Now, there maybe is a way where we could get aviation to fund more renewables, and that would make it cheaper for other people, but I don't think it makes sense right now to produce lots of electro fuel or hydrogen because we need that energy for so many other things. And you basically get 5 times the benefit if you use it to displace fossil fuels from the grid than you do producing jet fuel.
Thank you, Finlay. Yeah, very good point in terms of the energy intensity of flying. Should we be using our precious energy resources to fuel that? So we've just got a few more minutes before we come to questions from the audience. So can we just quickly go through, Finlay, do you have anything to add in terms of the practicalities of using sustainable aviation fuel in planes? So we already touched on the fact that most of it is drop-in, so we could use it now. But are there any kind of design issues? Are we needing to redesign aircraft for the future to be looking at that kind of thing?
Sorry, that was a question back to me. My connection just went off and I'm back. Yeah, basically hydrogen, hydrogen itself, I mean, basically you've got the same energy problems as e-fuel, really. The thing about hydrogen is you then need to compress it and liquefy it and put it to extremely cold temperatures. And even then it's got a massive volume. So you end up with the same energy consumption problem. It's not really much better than e-fuels. But then you also have a time scale issue because hydrogen aircraft would need to be completely redesigned because hydrogen is 4 times the volume of jet fuel. You need to put it in the fuselage, the tube section of the aircraft, rather than in the wings. That means you need to redesign your wing, redesign the aircraft. You also need to completely different refueling system. It's actually sort of, is this even technically feasible, particularly at a large scale? And particularly given where your excess renewable energy is maybe quite far from where your airport is. How do you transport hydrogen there? It may be quite difficult to have lots of solar around Heathrow because there's lots of urban areas. So you get energy from somewhere else, but then you make hydrogen there, transporting it. It's then very easy to leak hydrogen because it's at really low temperatures. It might boil off. So there's lots of efficiencies in the transport of it as well. So I think where you start to get to is you start to say everything has quite a high impact, has quite a high intensity. And that's why one of our main focuses needs to be on reducing total jet fuel use, because all of these options aren't great.
Thank you. Kate, can I come to you just to have a quick overview, perhaps, of how much, actually, I'll move on to the next slide, how much SAF we're actually using, because we have that target from the government of using 10% by 2030, but at the moment it's less than 1%. Is that right?
So it's less than 1% globally. I think in the UK it's a little bit higher, maybe 2%, maybe as high as 2%, because as Finn has alluded to, we've started importing loads of this stuff. I think, I mean, the 10% thing, as I've said, it's going to be really hard to meet. I think they're going to end up using lots of, to go back to kind of Rachel's opening comments, lots of the stuff that is cheaper and that they know they can use now. So it's going to be the used cooking oil, probably largely, maybe some other waste product, very little of the more expensive stuff that's been referred to by some panelists in the chat, that actually kind of cut, the power to liquid fuels are likely to be a very small proportion of that. Yeah, so I mean, future projections vary enormously around this. At the moment, the UK government's official modelling has probably around 25% by 2050 of aviation fuel, but they haven't made any kind of actual commitments to that beyond, as I say, this kind of headline 10% by 2030 thing. But that isn't necessarily going to reduce emissions, obviously, by 10%. That's going to be a fuel quantity.
Okay. Thank you. And just before we go to questions, I'd like to ask Rachel, so in kind of conceptual terms, so the industry and our politicians say, well, we're using SAF, we don't need to worry about flying, or we don't need to worry about emissions from flying because we've got this sustainable fuel. We're kind of looking at how that's not realistic, but also it's not going to be scaled up. We had that headline grabbing 100% SAF flight, but that's not going to be happening for, even if it were sustainable, that won't happen for a while. Do you have anything you want to kind of summarize or finish with in terms of what the aviation industry is saying? Is it all just greenwash? What should we be, how should we be reacting when we hear the aviation industry say, it's okay, we're solving this through SAF?
Well, I think it's been said by several people so far, which is that we really need to be focusing on reducing the amount of aviation, the number of flights, getting people's attention to understand the dire emergency that we are faced with on climate and biodiversity and various fronts, the poly crisis, some people call it. And, we can sit here and go off in the weeds about whether, carbon captured from here or this crop from there or garbage from where. And meanwhile, like, we're really in a very dire situation. And it's pretty clear, I think, that, the aviation industry is only growing, and we cannot afford to do that. We cannot fuel planes even at the current rate past just a very small percentage without huge impacts, and to scale that up in any significant way is just not going to work. I think Kate touched on the empathy for policymakers that you feel, and I identify with that because I have spoken a lot with different policymakers, and they're in a tough place, and it's on many different fronts. And it's when it comes back down to it, on so many different fronts, we end up coming up against economics and industry and jobs and money and common sense kind of goes out the window a lot of the time, because taking measures, certainly for policymakers to take positions or adopt policies or support policies that would cost an industry economically, is just not a strategy that is sustainable for policy makers. And that's, I feel like that's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Ultimately, it feels like SAF is a way for the industry to maybe pretend that everything is okay, or not even pretend. Like, there are lots of people who genuinely believe that this is going to help. But as many people have pointed out in the chat, and as we've kind of alluded to, in order to reduce emissions, we need to reduce the amount of fuel we burn, wherever that comes from, and that means flying less. And of course, that's the whole aim of Flight Free UK. We're encouraging people to fly less and giving them the means to do that. So yes, that's absolutely what we believe. And it's important to look at these issues and kind of unpick everything, so to show people that actually reducing emissions from aviation will come from flying less. We'll just move to questions then. So we've got 10 minutes left. And if we come to questions, and I'll see, and I know that Finley especially, and Kate as well, you've been answering some of the questions that have come up already. So thank you for that. If you have a question, please add it to the chat, or you can raise your hand, as Colin has just done. But first, I'd like to just pick up on one of the questions that was asked quite early on in the event from Ian, who highlighted the fact that, yes, generally we're talking about CO2 emissions, but there are many other emissions or many other climate impacts from aviation, not least water trails, vapor trails, and NOx, so nitrous oxide. Kate or Rachel or Finley, do you have anything that you want to say about that, just about those non-CO2 impacts?
I can do briefly.
Yes,
yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right that SAF, because it works basically like kerosene, will still generate non-CO2 impacts. I mean, those are big impacts on the climate. They've caused maybe 2/3 of the total warming to date, compared with kerosene. So they've had a larger, compared with CO2. So they've had a larger impact historically in terms of warming than CO2 has done. Really important. There is some evidence that SAFs might generate slightly less, have a slightly less sort of significant non-CO2 warming impact than kerosene, but they will still have one. Maybe that's enough for now from me.
Thank you. Okay, so Colin, would you like to go ahead? You can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I haven't got a question, but I've got a comment. It's not surprising that people who are very environmentally aware, environmentalists, are violently agreeing with each other about the issues regarding SAF. And, Finley, you've got a history in aviation, but a lot of people are discussing this subject theoretically, which is very important, and I'm not challenging that. I agree with it. My background is 20 years ago, I was chairman of DHL's biofuels business. And we withdrew from the market because there wasn't enough feedstock using hydrogenated vegetable oils for even road transport. And so I think it's important that people who have practical and commercial experience are part of the discussion. And we also need to look backwards as well as looking forwards. Historically, there have been many industry targets set for SAF introduction. They've all failed miserably. But also, if you look at non-renewable fuel sources like GTL, which is gas to liquid, so that's making oils and fuels out of gas. So Shell has a product, GTL. And after leaving DHL, I went to work for a fuel distribution business. And we were trying to sell GTL to all sorts of organizations, GTL reduces emissions by about 10 to 15% because it's much cleaner burn. And it's slightly more expensive. And even with a 5–10% increase in cost compared to double the cost with SAF, organizations would not take the financial hit of switching to GTL, even local authorities that were running public services like buses. So I think there is a commercial reality that it's easy to dismiss about, well, we're going to use SAF and it's going to cost more, but people will pay for it. They won't. It's going to be very difficult for businesses to accommodate any additional cost in their operations. So that's all I want to say. Not really a question, but more of a statement.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you for that insight. Very useful. Okay, so scrolling through the questions, Nick has a question. I'm going to read this out from you, Nick. So, how would the speakers respond to the argument, flying isn't going to stop, so we might as well create jobs in industrialized areas to make SAF? At least it's less harmful than kerosene. Now, I know that Nick's from the group against Leeds Bradford Airport, so definitely an aviation campaigner or an anti-aviation campaigner, but it's a very good question, and one that I'd like to put to Finlay, actually, as Safe Landing, your group looks into that kind of aspect in terms of jobs. So Finlay, would you like to go for that one?
Yeah, I suppose there's sort of there's two things. There's how do we create jobs in industrial areas that have lost jobs and could do with economic development. And then there's also what's the most efficient use of our resources and how do we decarbonize aviation? So one thing that is clear is that there's a sort of a no regrets thing, which is scaling up renewable electricity, because we need that for a variety of things. Eventually, we can use it for aviation. But if you look just from an engineering perspective, it makes a lot more sense to use renewables for decarbonizing the grid first and ground transport and buildings before you make an aviation fuel. But it will be in the aviation industry's interest to have lots of renewable energy so we can decarbonize everything else, and then it will have some it can use afterwards. So our position is, like, the main thing is we need to not distract from fossil fuels. So we need policies that target fossil fuels and driving those down. So stuff like jet fuel tax, frequent flyer levy, we'll raise money from that, and we can use that money to invest in those areas that need investment, to build genuine green technology, particularly renewables, maybe some green hydrogen, but use that for other purposes. And so it's more about thinking about what is actually sensible uses of technology and what will prove environmental in the long run. And I think if you think about it like that, you then create industries in those areas that are genuinely sustainable, and therefore they're economically sustainable in the long run, and that therefore will provide jobs. The danger with spending $1 billion on a city waste to jet fuel facility is, if there's very good reasons why that isn't very sustainable, that will be found out eventually, and we might have to stop it. And then all of the promised jobs will then not actually materialize, or there will be people hired, it'll operate for a few years and then it'll have to be shut down. So it might look good on paper, but is it good in reality? And if it's not, then there's actually quite a risk of those jobs like not existing. Whereas there's things that we know are the definite things we need to do, and there's lots of work required. So let's invest there and we'll get the maximum jobs for our investment as well. So, and that's the conversation we're having with unions, actually, because we're looking at some of these pathways and saying, well, actually, we need to be a bit more critical. What do we believe is going to work, and where do we want to have the jobs? We don't want our company or our council kind of selecting the wrong technology, backing a loser, not a winner, and then we're going to lose out. So there's a genuine self-interest for workers and for unions to actually critique this and decide what they think is most likely in the future.
Great answer. Thank you, Finlay. Okay, so we're just about coming to the end of the event. Thank you, everybody who's asked a question, and hopefully even if your question wasn't read out, our panelists have been writing answers and sending links and things like that. So hopefully those are all satisfactorily responded to. Kate or Rachel, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share, or do you think you've kind of covered everything in what we've spoken about already?
I think it's all done. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Kate. And Rachel, feeling good?
Yeah, I think, I would just say, there's a climate justice movement would say we need system change, not climate change. And the questions around jobs and economy and what drives us and what provides for us in the very most fundamental kind of way is where we need to be putting our attention.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, we'll finish then by reading out one of a very pithy comment from Corrie, who says, would it not be easier to reduce flying than increase the rates of SAF used? Which I think is, yes, absolutely. That kind of sums up the whole conversation, really. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you to our panelists. Hopefully the discussion has kind of illustrated the ways in which SAF is not sustainable. We intentionally call it so-called sustainable aviation fuel because we know that this isn't the answer. And of course, in order to reduce emissions from aviation, we need to reduce the amount we fly. But hopefully the information provided in this event has given you some arguments that you can share with other people around you, because not everybody knows. It's very easy to see the industry and our government talking about sustainable fuels and believing that they are sustainable and thinking, oh great, we can just carry on flying because here's the answer. So hopefully we've given you enough information that you can go and talk to others about that and kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of what the reality actually is. I'd like to thank our speakers. So thank you so much to Kate from Aviation Environment Federation, to Finlay from Safe Landing, and to Rachel from Biofuel Watch. And I'm Anna from Flight Free UK. Just to finish, we run these events for free every couple of months. But we obviously welcome donations. So if you want to donate to Flight Free UK, you can do at our website. If you want to keep up to date with future events, so we usually cover a different topic in each session, then please follow our social media. So we're at Flight Free UK across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're on LinkedIn, TikTok, etc. This event was recorded, so I will be sending a notification to everybody who attended with the link to the recording and also with a summary of all the things that went on in the chat. So all of those lovely links will be there after the event. But just to say one more time, thank you for supporting our work. Thank you for attending our event. Thank you to our panelists, and good night.